Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story begins at a ball. One of the girls was holding a beautiful piece of jewelry around her neck. But another lady suddenly ran up to her and asked her what she was even doing since it was her jewelry. She also added that she did not expect the girl to tear it so suddenly. The girl with the red hair was named Lisa, and she looked with disdain at the lady who was calling her crazy and didn't understand what was wrong with her. She got close to it and said it was ridiculous. That piece of jewelry was a family heirloom. She then whispered right in the very ear of the pink-haired girl about being tricked. Hers and it made her laugh. The lady immediately began to slowly back away and asked what the hell she was even talking about, and said that she wasn't stupid enough to believe it after all. Then she tried to snatch the jewelry from Lisa, but it was no use. She called it hers, but the girl wasn't going to give it away. Lisa said she wouldn't give it away, for she must return it to her estate. It belongs to her. Suddenly a man who was quite handsomely dressed and wearing glasses ran up to them. He turned to Miss Louise, and once he was already near the two girls, he anxiously inquired as to what was going on with them. The pink-haired girl immediately smiled and said that if he was this girl's servant, she wanted him to tell her to apologize to her for such behavior. But the man came close to Louise and took her hand, and kneeling down, asked her how it was that this was happening, and also inquired what would happen if she cut her delicate hands. Lisa had gotten used to this kind of behavior by now, so she said she was fine, so he shouldn't worry about it. When the man stood up and with a heavy sigh said that if the girl would just ask him, he would rip that woman's head off and she wouldn't bother her. But Louise, smiling nervously, replied that it would actually be too noisy, and she didn't want to draw unnecessary attention to them. The girl with pink hair immediately stepped aside and said that they just had the same personality, and it really annoyed her. Looking at Louise, she said that was the reason she was popularly nicknamed the red-haired witch. The girl paid absolutely no attention to her words, and in turn said that she was too noisy for a thief, and wondered what the hell she was talking about in the first place. Louise, smiling, said that she was a duchess and certainly no witch. Suddenly, another man approached them. He had blonde hair and was dressed very formally. When he came closer to them, he wondered what all the fuss was about, as absolutely all the guests present were already interested in their showdown. Louise, when she saw the gentleman, immediately became anxious. She said hello and came closer to him. Then the girl pointed to the jewelry she was holding and said that she had been given back her precious item. This didn't surprise him at all, so he said that he understood, and also that he was glad to hear it. When people saw this, they immediately started whispering amongst themselves, all because this man smiled. It was quite a rarity for them, for this was the Ice Duke Hennel, who almost never shows his emotions. Many guests could not even guess that his wife could be this red-haired witch, because they very much disliked this girl. But as soon as Duke Hennel heard this, he looked at them with a most stern look, not understanding why they dared to talk their business at all. He was very angry and said he didn't like his wife being insulted. So turning to Louise, he told them to leave already. The girl took him under her arm and started to walk away, but then suddenly he turned to her and told her to keep her distance. Louise immediately apologized to him and then wondered if he really didn't like having her so close. The man felt very embarrassed, but said that it was actually fine and asked that she not let go of his hand. His whole face even turned red with embarrassment. Just like that, they went somewhere far away from this event where everyone was discussing their personal lives. The pink-haired girl, who had just been standing there watching the whole time, immediately ran up after them and turned to Louise. She told the girl that if she left like that, it would be really bad. Louise suddenly stopped, and glimpsing this girl said that she had spoken an interesting phrase, namely that she was not that stupid, and she agreed with her statement. So she turned around and just walked away. And after returning, Louise was finally able to get her necklace. All her family heirlooms and magic stones had been brazenly stolen, and she had a goal to definitely get them back and thus save her own father. But everything that had happened before was only a dream for poor Louise, and she also dreamed of her own death and the betrayal of her family. In the morning, she couldn't stand it and woke up in a cold sweat. When she looked around, she realized she was still alive, unlike the dream she'd had. Louise began to scrutinize her hands and couldn't believe that she had somehow returned to her past. And all that she had dreamed was not a dream at all, but her past reality. But suddenly a man came into her room. His name was Romain, and he was her assistant. He immediately turned to her and asked her if she was well. Louise looked at him in surprise and wondered why he looked so alarmed. The man replied that he had heard a scream, so he had entered her room without permission. He stood right next to her bed and asked her if she was all right. The girl replied that she was fine and also asked where her glasses were. Romani helped her get her glasses, with which she could see well, and the girl thanked him for it. When Louise put on her glasses, she looked around the room again. She still had tears in her eyes from what she had experienced. Now it was clear to her how this time reversion worked after all. She looked at him and said that it was a time when he was still with her. But Romain was very surprised to hear this and asked what she was talking about because he was her servant. And if he didn't get fired, he would be by her side for the rest of his life. But Louise said nothing, only laughed loudly. She was silent for a while and then asked what day it was. The man looked at her anxiously and asked if she was all right, for it was the 15th day of the flower month. He also said that this was the 726th year of the regular calendar. When Louise heard this, she immediately realized that she'd gone back a year. The girl finds herself at a time when her father has been arrested, and at that moment her family has fallen apart. She looked down somewhere, sighing heavily, and concluded for herself that she wished she had come back a little sooner, in order to prevent this from happening. But then, after a little reflection, the girl realized that she still couldn't give up. Louise started to get out of bed, and turning to her assistant, said that he might not believe her, of course. However, she asked him to at least listen to her. She went to the window and, opening the curtains, said that once she was dead, she had been brazenly cheated and murdered. Romani, hearing this, was very surprised and wondered if this was really the case. The girl then looked at him and said that she only confessed it because she trusted him, and said that all these events had happened in her first life. The girl was Lisa Shart. She was born into a count's family. Her family was well versed in ancient magic, and her father even once worked at a research institute. That's why Louise also continued this kind of study of magic. She had read many books since she was a little girl and wanted to try everything in practice. People thought she was just crazy, so they nicknamed her the red-haired witch who only wants to ruin their lives. However, she also had a fiancé who always supported her and talked about not paying attention to all of them. The man also told her that he wanted to be the only one to see her charm and how unique she was. And Louise certainly believed him when he told her that he loved her as she was. It made her feel incredibly good to hear him say that. Her fiancé also talked about how even her father constantly praises her for the accomplishments she is achieving. When Louise heard this, she said, smiling, that it was really in his spirit, and he always liked to support her. Count Past was the man who admired her every day. He was like the sun in the darkness. And the girl didn't care at all about the people who hated her, because she had those who accepted her for who she was, and she was happy. But yet one day her father was arrested for using things for dark magic. Of course, Lisa didn't believe it all and said that he would never do such a thing. But the people from the organs didn't listen to her. The girl kept saying that he understood the danger of this venture better than anyone else. And when she yelled at them, the man who was taking her father away suddenly even swung around to hit her with anger. However, her father managed to react in time and stood up for his daughter, so the man hit him hard in the face. He couldn't even stay on his feet, so he fell to the ground. Louise immediately ran up to him and, still crying loudly, asked if he was all right. Then his father, addressing the people who were arresting him, said that they had irrefutable evidence, so they were obliged to take him away. They immediately took him by the arms and began to lead him out of the room. The girl continued to sit on the floor and, addressing them, asked them to stop. But of course no one listened to her, and no one was going to let her father go. Before finally leaving, the father, smiling, told his daughter not to worry, for he was innocent. He asked her to make tea for herself and wait for him. The man kept repeating that he would be back very soon and called her his dear daughter. However, in the end, he never came. Those people said that he wanted to overthrow the country using dark magic, so he was put behind bars and the Shart family was completely destroyed. That's when Louise was left all alone with her grief. Everyone just abandoned her. The servants who worked on the estate left, leaving her alone. And even Romani wasn't going to stay there. He simply walked away, deflected, because he couldn't ruin his reputation like that. But deep down, the girl knew perfectly well that her father was innocent, and she didn't want things to go on like this. Immediately after the house was empty, the girl sat on her bed and cried because she was very upset, when suddenly a man ran into her room. It was her fiancé, and his name was Sured. He was her fiancé, and his name was Sured. Their engagement had failed, but he had come to see her anyway, and the girl assumed that he was worried about her. Louise immediately got up and ran over to him to hug him, for he was the only one she had left at all. But halfway there, Sured stopped her with his hand and told her that her father would be executed soon. He had heard that it would happen tomorrow. When Louise heard this, she couldn't even stand on her feet. She fell to the ground and kept screaming that it was all a lie. Before her eyes, the girl had snippets of her childhood, how she and her father had studied a great deal together, and she had just talked about how it couldn't be, because her father was definitely not guilty. It was very hard for her to realize that the very next day he would be gone. Suddenly the man stepped closer to her, lifted her head to his, and asked if she would like to use the power of the diamond to go back in time. When the girl heard this, she asked in a crying voice what he was even saying. In fact, their family owned 6 stones with special power, and in the confiscation of property, 5 stones were taken away from their family. The only one the girl could hide was the diamond with the ability to travel through time. It was in her ring. So her fiancé, coming close to her, asked that she be sure to use it, for perhaps then her father could be saved. Soon after, they arrived at a rather remote little house and started down into the basement somewhere. The man, looking around, wondered if he was really hidden in such a place. Louise, who was walking ahead, replied that her grandfather had used that lab, and the diamond was just about there. Soon she went to the shelves and saw a small box. The girl immediately said that it was in there. When the man heard about it, he said it was just fine. Then he went up to her and stuck the blade in her stomach and said that everything had happened as expected of her. The girl didn't immediately realize what had happened, but when she began to bleed completely, she was very surprised. Her so-called good fiancé said that he was finally able to get the stone. Louise looked at Sured in surprise and wondered why he had done it at all, for she really thought he loved her and would never betray her. Soon she could no longer stand still, and falling to the ground, she lost the box, from which the ring with the diamond fell out. He stepped closer and took that ring and exhaled with relief, saying he was tired of wearing the gentleman's mask already. Louise stared at him in surprise before she died and couldn't believe that this man had really betrayed her and that she was wrong about him. Out of her last strength, she uttered, "Has he really been deceiving her all this time?" Shart, scrutinizing the ring, replied that he had gotten close to her in order to get what he wanted. Then, taking her by the hair, he pulled her up and told her that he couldn't believe that she really thought a red-haired witch could be his wife. With a smile on his face, he said she was an idiot like her father. At that moment, tears started to come to her eyes. Shart continued to mock her and wondered if she really didn't expect him to set up her father to keep him out of their way. But at that moment, another girl ran into the room. It was Baron Zane's daughter, and Louise had heard that she was also called the social fairy. The pink-haired lady moved closer to the man and asked him how long he would be there. The guy tossed Louise aside and said he didn't expect this girl could take up so much of his time, but now he had his diamond, so they could be on their way. He put his arm around the girl, and the Baron's daughter replied that if he could have loved her a little sooner, they would have been the happiest of people. As Louise watched this sweet couple, all she could think about was that they were the reason her father and family heirlooms were lost. She wasn't going to just forgive them and let them go. So rising to her feet with the last of her strength, she pulled her blade from her stomach and ran straight at them. All she managed to do was cut her ex-fiancé on the cheek so that he even bled. He was very angry that he would now have a scratch on his face and possibly a scar in the future. Because it happened very suddenly, he let the ring slip out of his hands. The Baron's daughter immediately crouched down and started looking for it. She said that she had managed to find it after all, so she suggested running away as soon as possible. Shart wasn't going to leave her so easily, so he kicked Louise one last time with his foot right into her open wound. The girl began to cough even more and fell to the ground. At last he smiled happily and said they would see each other again, and called her an idiot. When the door closed, Louise rolled over onto her other side and wondered who else was an idiot. From behind her back, she pulled out the original diamond ring and thought about how she had been able to trick him at the last minute, even while mortally wounded. At the same moment, she put that ring on her finger, and everything around her started to be much brighter because the magic had activated. Louise's only thought was that she wanted to go back in time to correct her mistake and by no means die. And so, when the girl told the whole story to her assistant, she also added at the end that in this way she was able to use the power of the diamond to return to the past. When the man heard this, he was quite surprised, but said that he had actually always hated that child. He wondered if it might be a good idea to bury her future fiancé in the ground and use it as fertilizer for flowers, or just throw it on fish food. But Louise looked him straight in the eye and said that everyone would find out about it, so you can't take such a risk. Her assistant immediately apologized and said that he had just been ill-mannered. The girl turned aside and told him that he should listen to her advice more, and she wondered how he was able to believe her story at all so quickly. Romain looked up and said that his mistress would never lie, so he could not doubt her words. Louise then said thoughtfully that when she had attacked that couple with the dagger, she had been able to replace the diamond with a fake one. All because her grandfather gave her a specially fake version because she was pretty obsessed with love. And diamond's power could only be used once. And Louise, remembering what had happened in her past life, realized that she never wanted to fall in love with anyone again. At that time, her father was already in prison, so the first thing she was going to do was to save him, and then think about her future life. And she wasn't going to die again. Louise moved closer to the balcony and wondered who had come into the lab when she was almost dead. It was indeed true. Before she could use the ring, some blonde-haired man walked in on her and, falling down in front of her, was simply terrified. She knew who was calling her by name, and she knew it would help her. Then suddenly the assistant turned to her and said that he still couldn't understand one thing. Why in the past he had left the mistress completely alone. Louise, looking at him, replied that there were some circumstances, but then suddenly she remembered what he had said on the day she had moved to. The girl was very disturbed and said it was very bad. And that's because, if things continue like this, history will just repeat itself. For a while she pondered over what she should do, but afterward she told Romana that they should be on their way. The man bowed and replied to the lady that of course he would accompany her all the time, so she could not worry. Louise thought of taking all their family heirlooms from them, as well as messing up their lives like they did hers. At this very time, the blonde-haired man returned to the manor, and he was immediately greeted by all the servants. The butler who stood in front bowed, and turning to the gentleman, said that he was very glad to see him, and added that he was surprised that the man had returned so early from as far north as he was. The lad, stepping closer to him, asked that the butler stop calling him that, for he is the head of this estate, Duke Doran's. But the servant, smiling, said that he had called him that since he was a boy, but changing the subject of the conversation, still insisted on his own, and inquired why he had come back so early. Butler also added that he was pretty sure the man would stay there for another year and develop magical tools. The boy, stepping forward, replied that he had had a rather frightening and strange dream. Thinking about it, he immediately told it to the butler, and the butler replied that it was very much like a prophetic dream. Duke looked at him and inquired if there had been any trouble while he was away. Butler replied that some people now considered them enemies. When the boy heard that, he thought for a moment and replied that it meant his threat had worked after all, but they should still be grateful that he had let them live at all. Afterward, he inquired about that report. The butler immediately remembered it and said that it was not a family matter. However, his young master had been worried about Miss Lizzie Shart for quite some time. At this very time, Louise had already packed up and was on her way to run errands with her assistant. Romany, who was sitting across from her, wondered if his sister was really going to be attacked. The girl replied that this was perfectly true. She had been seriously wounded, and he had left her to take care of her. Louise, also hesitating, said that she thought Surette might be involved. Perhaps he planned to destroy all the people closest to her, which was why he'd even gotten to his sister. Louise immediately thought of her fiancé. She'd met him 2 years ago when her father was being laughed at by everyone. She was too depressed and couldn't stand all the talking behind her back anymore. One day, as she was sitting in the forest, a man came up to her and asked if she was Lisa Shart. The girl didn't say anything, but only glanced at him. It was Surette, and he said that he was surprised that such a girl could become a scientist, and added that he would like to meet her. This guy was incredibly kind and considerate at first. Louise looked at him in surprise and wondered if he really thought it was unbelievable. He sat down next to her and said, of course, and asked if she didn't think so herself. Without waiting for an answer, he took her by her red hair and told her that she needed to assert her boundaries, because he couldn't believe that she was actually being called a witch by people. He smiled and said that her eyes were incredibly beautiful. In that moment, Louise felt as if her world really had become much brighter. The memories even gave her goosebumps as she rode in the wagon. She wished she could forget him forever. Louise looked out the window and wondered how she would act when she actually met this guy. Soon after, they arrived at a small coffee shop where they were greeted by a young girl. Her name was Morosa. When she opened the door, she saw dear Louise, with whom she had been in good touch, and also her brother. She was very surprised and wondered why they had come to her so unexpectedly. The mistress, coming closer to her, smiled and replied that she had come to see her pretty face, for she missed her. Morosa sighed heavily upon hearing this and said that she was incredibly sad about the situation that mistress was going through, for she must be having a very hard time. Louise, smiling, replied that she was actually fine, and added that she was well aware of how difficult it was to run such a large store on her own. As she looked around, she saw that everything was in perfect condition, and said that the girl was doing a great job that she could manage quite like this. She also inquired as to how things were going at her candy store. Morosa, smiling, thanked her for being so excited and told her that her store finally had a steady income, and it was all thanks to the Shart family who had rescued them, since they literally used to live in a dump. And it's pretty hard for a girl to realize where she is now, because back then it seemed to her that life would never be good. She, smiling, looked at her brother and wondered if she was saying all this correctly. Romany, turning to his mistress, confirmed the information and said that he could never repay them. Then suddenly, Morosa laughed and said that she couldn't get used to the fact that her brother was now pretending to be a gentleman. They started arguing amongst themselves over it, and Louise watched his sister and couldn't believe that her fiancé actually had the courage to attack a bright girl like her. That was why she would never be able to forgive him. Then, Louise interrupted their conversation and asked if she had already made plans to go out tonight. Morosa was surprised to hear this, but replied that she had to go to a regular customer to give him sweets. When the girl heard that, she immediately smiled and realized that that's where it was going to happen, so she asked if she could do it instead. She reached forward and said there was no way she was going to let her mess with him, so she had to do it herself. Soon, as evening fell, some men were standing outside the candy store behind the alley, and one of them wondered why they didn't just attack the owner. His partner said nothing to that and said they had an incredibly easy job after all and were very lucky to have it. Then they noticed that a man came out of the bakery carrying a basket. they immediately thought that it was the girl they were to attack. The men stepped around her, blocking the road, and asked her to stop. The girl immediately did so. One of them put his hand on her shoulder and offered to have fun with them. Of course, Louise was behind that cloak, and she told him to take his hand away. When the bully heard this, he wondered how she even dared to answer him anything, and added that she should quickly follow him in a nice way. Louise, looking him straight in the eye, replied that she had, after all, asked nicely to be let go, and also called them idiots. The girl started squeezing his hand very hard, and the guy screamed when he saw her face and wondered who she even was. But at that moment, Romain ran out to them at once. He struck them and put them down in one movement. Afterwards, he turned to the young lady and asked her if she was all right. The girl took off her hood and replied that she was indeed fine and thanked him for his help. She added, smiling, that their devious plan had succeeded after all, and that was a very good thing. His partner stood next to the guy lying on the floor and asked in a shaky voice what had even happened, as well as who they were. When he saw Romany, he knew at once that he had better run, and when he tried to do so, it was all to no avail. The girl's assistant was running contentedly fast, so he overtook him and immediately knocked him to the ground, twisting his arms to prevent him from resisting. He turned angrily to this guy and said that people who hurt his sisters suffer long and very agonizingly and just wish they were dead. He looked at the bully and wondered who hired them in the first place, also adding that if the guy wasn't going to tell him, the first thing he would do was break his arm. But the latter, only laughing, wished him luck and said that he would by no means give up. Romany began to twist his arm violently, and when he screamed, he said it was not a threat at all, but a warning. Louise, who had been standing off to the side and watching all this, was contentedly surprised. She thought of the fact that he certainly needed to turn in the measure, but there was no way she would be able to calm him down. But she was glad that now Romain would never leave her alone. He would always be there for her. When it was all over, the girl went back to the candy store and spent the night there. The next day, early in the morning, she was already packed. Morosa, who had come out to escort her, wondering if it was really time for her to leave. Louise, smiling, replied that that was absolutely right. She had already finished her business, so it was time for her to go home. Then suddenly the girl came closer to her and, taking her hand, said that she didn't think her father was at fault at all. And with a smile, Morosa also added that she really hoped that he would be released soon and everything would be back to normal. Louise was incredibly pleased to hear those words, and the girl, also smiling, said that if she could help her in any way, she wanted her to let her know. She also added that she was absolutely sure that her brother would protect her for the rest of his life. Romain, who was standing next to her, replied that of course he would. At that moment, the girl thought that she would definitely not be alone in this life, so everything would be fine. She smiled and thanked the two of them, and said that she was absolutely sure that she would soon be able to save her father. Soon afterward, she and her assistant headed outside. They were going home, so they passed through town to catch a wagon. Suddenly, a rather familiar man blocked her way. It was Surid, of course, and he was addressing her. When Louise saw him, she was very surprised. She even stopped, for she did not understand what he wanted. The man started to come closer to her and said that it was quite an unexpected encounter, because he didn't think he could see her in such a place. When the girl saw him, she immediately realized that he was exactly the same, come to make sure her plan was successful. And all because it was Surid who hired those thugs who were supposed to kill poor Morosa. And Louise is quite sure that after his failure, he was very angry. Suddenly, the assistant approached her. He whispered that this crook must be up to something again, and the girl said that was perfectly true. She thought so too. In fact, Louise has to play her part well this time for her plan to work. So she said, smiling, that it was an incredible coincidence, and also that she was very happy to see him. The man was very surprised to hear this, but he began to smile, not understanding what she even meant, and also what a silly girl like her was doing in the city. This all made him incredibly angry, because she also came with a disgusting servant that he definitely doesn't trust. He also didn't understand why there was no news from the people who had attacked his sister. And right at this moment, the girl was sitting quietly in her store, so he couldn't understand what had happened there at all. Then suddenly Louise turned to him and inquired if he was all right, for he had somehow turned pale even. Shart, laughing nervously, replied that he was just tired after the mission his father had given him, and wondered about her herself. The girl replied that she still had things to do, so she suggested we talk some other time. After that, she turned around and just started walking away. When the boy heard this, he was very surprised, but he dared not say anything, for it would be too suspicious. Louise, moving a decent distance away from him, told herself that there was no way she was going to let him catch her again. She should have the information first. When she said that, the assistant looked at her in surprise and asked what she even meant. Louise replied that she assumed that Baron Zane's daughter had conspired with him to destroy her father. That way they would definitely be able to easily get rid of her, as she would be left without any allies on her side. Romany inquired whether there was any other reason for blaming her father. The girl replied that of course there was. Louise explained that they were eager to get their hands on a family heirloom with a magic stone, for they were inspired by her ability. She thought about the fact that if she could trace the stolen magic stone, she might be able to find the creator as well. Some time had passed since then, and she had finally returned back to the manor after all. The assistant was standing next to her, and the girl said that his plan was a failure, so he wouldn't act for a while. She had no guarantee that he wouldn't target Morosa again, so they should definitely guard her. Romain, hearing this, became a little wary and said that there was no way he would leave Madame alone, so they needed the help of others. Louise sighed heavily and, realizing it herself, said that they really needed to find more allies. In fact, she couldn't rely on her blood relatives, for they were like hyenas who only want to steal more property. So it was quite a challenge for her to find someone to rely on. Louise pondered all this for a while, and then a good thought occurred to her. When the man saw the enlightenment on her face, he asked if she had any thoughts on the matter. The girl hesitated and replied that she had one idea, but it was rather dangerous and might not even work. The aide immediately inquired what it was about, and the girl replied that they must go to Duke Dorence. Romany, hearing this, wondered in surprise if it was the same Duke. Louise explained that they do the same magical research, so her father was friends with the previous head of the family. However, the assistant replied that the head of the estate had already changed at that time. The girl thought about it and replied that he was absolutely right. That person was even called Iceblood. Namely, it was Henel Dorence. The current head, at such a young age, had already managed to become one of the best researchers of ancient magic. In ancient times, there were wizards who could arrange miracles, but none of them lived to see this time. That's why at that point, the magic books and tools that these people left behind were actively sought after. If a person could officially claim to research ancient magic, then he could become the pride of his country and an authority. The highest level is a first-class researcher. Louise, of course, wanted to become a successful girl researcher, but it is quite difficult to do so. The head of the Dorence family thinks only of his magic, indifferent and cruel to others and even ruthless. This man has an absolutely icy heart, and he certainly hated Louise, for they had done research together several times, in which he had always watched her closely. The girl is pretty sure he doesn't want someone like her doing magical research. The assistant listened attentively and asked if she wanted to send him a letter. The assistant listened to her carefully and asked if she wanted to send him a letter. She sighed heavily and added that she might have to wag her tail at this man to get their cooperation. As expected of the Duke's family, the estate was luxurious. Louise could see that when he agreed to take her in. She and Romany put on pretty suits to look very nice. As soon as they arrived at the audience, they sat in the guest room and waited. In fact, Louise never thought she would send him a letter on her own, nor did she expect him to want to meet her anytime soon. Suddenly, the assistant leaned over to the girl and asked her to be careful. Louise realized it herself, so she replied that everything would be all right. Soon afterward, they sat for a while longer, and then the door finally opened. The very sinister Henel Dorensay entered the room. When the girl saw him, she immediately noticed the icy stare he was giving her. Louise also thought that the nickname people had given him fit him perfectly. She realized that he already hated her, and that made her feel a little uncomfortable. Gaining courage and mindful of her manners, she stood up and walked closer to him and bowed. The girl thanked him for agreeing to meet her after all, for she was quite grateful to him for that. The girl continued to bow before him and said she was incredibly honored, and also offered to get right to the point so as not to delay him. The man stared at her for a while, and afterward hesitatingly said only one word: glasses. The girl, hearing this, looked at him in surprise and wondered what he meant. Henel looked quite serious and wondered what had happened to her glasses, for she had always worn them. Louise was puzzled when she heard this. She did not understand what kind of question it was and, most importantly, why he was asking it. And yet that meant he really remembered her. So she laughed and said that she wore the glasses for beauty, not for sight. A few hours before they arrived at the manor, the girl stood in front of her closet, choosing a suitable outfit. She was thinking of going to the Duke's estate itself, so she must look appropriate. But she couldn't find anything in her closet, so she went to the nearest store. There were many suitable options, but the prices were unbelievably high. As she stood next to the racks and picked out a dress, pondering the price, she heard some talking nearby. One of the girls who was present in the store asked if this was not the same red-haired witch. The other replied that it was, and also told her friend that the head of the family had committed a crime and their house was about to fall apart. Her friend replied that this girl even turned out to be much worse than she thought. They also thought that this store did not have the right clothes for her. Louise sighed heavily, turned to her assistant, and said that apparently they really enjoyed discussing the lives of others. Romany replied that he was disgusted to hear such a thing, and added that if she gave him permission, he would do everything he could to make sure it never happened again. But the girl replied that he shouldn't worry so much because it wasn't that bad. In fact, she thought about the fact that if her aide wasn't around, she would be protected by Sire. However, she was no longer the naive girl she had been before her death. Therefore, she is capable of fending for herself. Louise turned to the ladies who were standing nearby. The girls were frightened when she addressed them. She came closer and said that maybe she really wasn't right for this store, but they couldn't criticize the man behind his back. As they walked past them, Louise also said that this was ruining the store's reputation as well as their own. After that, she started walking towards the exit of the town with her head up, and the ladies were just furious about it. As she walked past the display case, Louise noticed her glasses. They were her grandfather's, and she had asked her father for them for her 6th birthday. And he really did, for he loved his daughter very much and wanted to make her happy. However, now was a different time for Louise, so after taking off those glasses, she went to the assistant and asked that he take them to a pawn shop and sell them. In fact, real gold was used to frame the glasses, so Louise thought that the money they would be given for them should be enough to buy a proper dress. Romany was well aware of how precious those glasses were to her, and wondered if she really thought it was so necessary. Louise sighed heavily and said that there was nothing more to be done, especially they could be picked up a little later, so she wasn't too worried about it. When she replied to the Duke that she had decided to take off her glasses, he only replied that he understood and started to walk away. The guy sat down on the couch and told her to sit down too because he was willing to listen to her request. Louise didn't hesitate to come over and sit across from him. She said she had come about the letter to ask for financial and personnel support from his family. She also added that she didn't know if he would believe her or not, but her father, who was arrested, was completely innocent. He was framed by someone. That was why she wanted to prove his innocence and save him. However, she just needed his help. The girl was silent for a while, and then said that she was ashamed to ask him to do such a thing, but she would very much like him to show sympathy and lend a helping hand. Henel looked at her for a while, then replied that her father practiced dark magic and deceived people. When the girl heard this, She was very surprised, and she wanted to know what he would say next. And the Duke did indeed continue. He said that her father was a researcher of ancient magic who took his experiments seriously. Louise couldn't believe that even though he hated her, he still respected her father. But then, suddenly Hennel said that even with all this, no matter how well their families had gotten along, he couldn't just help her. Louise immediately realized what the catch was, so she smiled and said that everything was absolutely right, and so she would like to offer him something interesting from her side. Romani, who was standing nearby, bowed and immediately began pulling a small box out of his pocket. He held it out to his mistress, and Louise, opening it, showed the Duke a ring with a magic stone. When the Duke saw it, he was immediately interested and asked if this was really it. The girl smiled, was very pleased, for she knew that the Duke had long taken an interest in their family heirlooms, and all because these particular gemstones were the best object to explore. So she really hoped it would work out. Louise said that if the man cooperated with her, she would provide him with the ring and her grandfather's research material. And if the rest of the stolen magic stones were returned soon, she would give those to him as well. So, looking him straight in the eye, she wondered what he would say to such an offer. Hennel hesitated and just looked her straight in the eye for a while. Then with a sigh, he said that was a pretty good offer. However, he added that it would not be enough. Louisa was very surprised to hear this, as she thought it would be more than enough. The girl tried to remain calm and wondered if there was anything else she could offer him to make the deal work. The man was silent for a while, and then asked her what she thought about offering herself. Louise was wary when she heard this and thought it was a joke, so she asked him what he meant. Hennel replied that if she wanted him to help her, she should marry him. When he said these words, he looked very serious and even a little worried. Louise still couldn't understand that he was being serious and asked if he really wanted a wedding. Then her assistant entered the conversation and said that it was rude of him. He was already angry because he was being disrespectful to the girl. But the Duke, turning to him, said that he was, after all, a mere servant, so he was not allowed to interfere in their conversation. He then turned to Louise again and said that she, after all, desired support, and in return, she would provide knowledge and family heirlooms of the Shart family. In order to accomplish what she wants more quickly, they'd better become related. Then things will be much easier. However, their parents, who initially had a good friendly relationship, decided to strengthen their bond with a marriage between the two loved ones. When Louise heard this, she was very surprised and asked if it was her grandfather's fault. The girl really didn't understand how it happened and also why he did it without mutual consent. Hennel said the promise was forgotten, and she herself ended up with a new fiancé. The man was silent for a while, and then said that he had recently heard that something had happened on their estate and the engagement had been broken off. Louise looked at him in surprise and wondered how he even knew about all this. Duke did not wish to answer this question, but only asked if she wanted to help her father. She nodded her head immediately, and then he added that if she couldn't accept the offer, she would simply be refused help. The girl didn't understand what was even going on, and also whether he was serious about marrying her. She was silent for a while, and then said that she still didn't understand what benefit the Duke would get after their wedding. Louise sighed heavily and added that the red-haired witch would be his wife now, and asked if he was sure of his decision. He was silent for a while, and then wanted to say something, but they were interrupted by the gentleman's assistant, who ran into the room. The man apologized to him for this behavior, but said it was very important. The guy said the magic tool they were transporting had malfunctioned and was destroying everything in their garden. Hennel, when he heard about this, was very surprised and asked how this was even possible, but immediately went to the garden to check everything out and fix the problem. And it was indeed so. In the courtyard of the manor stood a huge creature with a stone in its chest, which walked and destroyed absolutely everything around it. The guards ran up to quiet him. Their chief told the others to get the wounded out of the danger zone, while the others tried to hold him down. But one of the guards replied that they could not detain him, for he was too strong. He said that they needed the Lord's help, for they could not do it otherwise. At that moment, the boy and the girl went outside and saw this stone creature. Louise, when she saw it, immediately inquired if it was a golem. The man replied that it was a magical instrument and had its own number. When the girl heard this, she immediately remembered that it was also used as a weapon in ancient times and could only be handled by items of the second grade and above. She knew full well that it had to be stopped as soon as possible, for it would only intensify and do more destruction in the future. Henel turned to the others who had come out with him and told them to stay in their seats. And that's because now it was his turn to deal with the problem. And just as he was about to go to the monster, he heard a strange whisper. Turning to the side, he saw Louise saying something in a magical language. She used her magic, and everything around her began to glow. She asked in magical language for this golem to calm down. The man watched all this intently, for he didn't think she would want to interfere in the situation. When Golem heard this spell, his crystal began to glow less, and he stopped, closing his eyes. The gods who were nearby saw this and immediately rejoiced, saying that he had somehow fallen asleep. Louise opened her eyes to see that her spell had worked, and jumped for joy and said that she had been able to stop the golem after all. Romany, who stood behind, bowed and said that he had expected nothing less from his mistress. Henel came closer to her and was very surprised. He said he didn't know she could create magic without using a magic book. The girl smiled and answered that she had read them as a child, so she remembered everything very well, because she had reread them several times. He was so enraptured by the girl that he couldn't even resist saying that she was just incredible and unique. Louise, hearing this, looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. Duke turned around and said he needed to clean things up, so he offered to postpone their conversation indefinitely and asked her to think about marriage. When they returned to the estate, her assistant immediately stated that he was strongly opposed to this marriage. He explained that he did not know how this man would treat her in the future, for she had seen for herself how coldly he talked to everyone. This Romany was so angry that he even had veins protruding on his arms. He shouted that he had the impression that she was being sold for a good price. Louise, when she saw the look on his face, said that selling was out of the question, so she asked that he calm down. The girl realized that this was a pretty good solution to their problem, and to be more precise, it was an incredibly profitable offer for her. She just needs to marry the right man, and then she'll get everything she needed. Then suddenly they heard some footsteps, and the assistant immediately turned his attention to them. When Louise turned to the side, she said that she had come again. She immediately recognized who it was. Then a woman also entered the room, and with a heavy sigh, said that this house is just as depressing. And on top of that, the mold continues to grow at full speed. Louise was not thrilled that her aunt had come to see her, for she disliked her very much. This woman was Belladonna, and also a very wicked countess. She was the sister of her late mother. This woman is the complete opposite of Louise's mother, who was a bright and very kind person. She is a prime example of a gold coin lover. A woman married a member of an earl's family, but her husband was unfaithful. And Auntie, because of this man, humiliated poor Louise all the time, bickering and insulting her. She was trying to steal their wealth, so Belladonna was still that hyena. Even in her previous life, she came at the same time as this time. Louise stood up and walked closer to her and said she was very glad she was doing well, but asked that the woman not enter the manor again without permission. Belladonna, hearing this, was very surprised and said that it was so impertinent of her. She also said with a heavy sigh that the girl was just like her disgusting little sister. She even inherited that horrible dull and red hair color and expresses herself just disgustingly. Belladonna said that when her sister died, she was even relieved, and then it turned out that her brother-in-law was a criminal too. She added that she was very concerned about it, which is why she was coming to see her to check if everything was at least okay there. Louise was incredibly angry, but she realized that she needed to keep her cool. After all, she didn't have time to deal with this horrible man, so holding back her anger, she turned to her aunt and said that if she had finished, she could leave. But she waved her hand and said that she had not finished, but was just beginning. Belladonna turned to her sweet but unhappy niece and told her that she had brought some pretty good news for her. Louise knew perfectly well what good news it would be, but Auntie said that since her engagement had been broken off, she had decided to introduce her to a new young man. And she also said that very soon the girl would be able to marry him, and her new husband would turn out to be Viscount Durangi. Auntie said that although he was a little older than the girl, yet he was a very kind and rich man, and it was a pretty good deal for her. When Louise heard this, she was simply astonished, for this man was not kind at all. He was vile and disgusting, and he was not just a little older than she was, but 30 years older. None of this mattered, however, for her aunt had then already deceived her in her past life. Louise was really going to marry the Viscount. She was only paid to make her niece do it. Eventually, Louise's strength was taken away, and she came face to face with him that day. He almost raped the poor and defenseless girl. Even though the engagement was broken off, she still didn't want anyone but Sured to touch her. So she hit him and ended up breaking the deal. However, the aunt was so furious that she then beat her as hard as she could until she was half dead. So Louise absolutely did not want to experience something like that again, so she had to think of something. Her aide came up behind her and asked if she would refuse her aunt, for he knew perfectly well that it was not the best option for her husband either. Louisa said that of course she would not agree to it. Certainly Romany had not been around then, and she had had to agree. But things were very different now. She thought about how it would be far better to marry that cold-blooded duke than that horrible Viscount, for she simply had no other choice. So, Louise turned to her aunt and said that she would like to explain something very important to her. The woman immediately turned in her direction and listened attentively. Seeing the look on her face, Belladonna suggested that she must be so happy. That's why she wanted to thank her for such a great opportunity. Or she was just such a simpleton that she envied her unfading beauty. When Auntie said these words, she smiled slyly, for she loved to be praised. Louise, however, replied that it was not so at all. The woman did not listen to her and said that under any circumstances, she would meet the Viscount the day after tomorrow. And after warning her about it, the woman said she should prepare herself well for it. After that, she turned around and just walked away. For some time, Louise and her assistant just stood in complete silence. Then the girl asked her assistant if he had noticed anything strange. Romany looked at her and asked how she was feeling. The girl replied thoughtfully that it was rather strange. Louise asked if he thought her aunt had somehow magically managed to get younger. The aide, upon reflection, said that she was indeed right, for the woman looked much younger than she had before. Actually, because Louise was in a terrible position, she hadn't even noticed it in her previous life, but now she was finally sure of it since even Romany had confirmed it. She turned to the assistant and said that her aunt had one of their family heirlooms. The man was very surprised to hear this. Louise said it's a ruby with the power of rejuvenation. It keeps you forever young. The girl explained that she was able to catch a glimpse of her new necklace, and it looked incredibly similar to that stone. However, the aide hesitated and said the family heirlooms had been confiscated by the government, and he didn't understand how this man could have it. Louise replied that she did not know it herself, but that she was absolutely certain of her theory. In fact, the target of the enemy who accused her father was the magic stones, and the girl couldn't believe that he was deliberately letting others use them at the same time. She wondered even more what his purpose even was, since magic stones were too dangerous for beginners, and in order to activate the power of this ruby, one must abide by terribly cruel conditions. Therefore, the best option Louise could have chosen would have been to marry Henley in order to carry out her plan and expose everything. Some time later, she returned to his estate for another visit, and the man suggested that they return to talk about the wedding. He wondered what her answer would be, yes or no. She thought for a while longer, but afterwards, smiling, she said that her answer, of course, would be no. When the Duke heard that, his world just collapsed. He hadn't expected her to actually say no to this. However, Louise clarified that she was telling him no at the moment. He was starting to get angry and wondered what that even meant. because he really didn't understand what she meant. The girl explained that her own aunt had pulled something behind her back, and the very next day she was meeting with the Viscount about their engagement. When Hinnel heard the surname of this Viscount, he asked thoughtfully if she really liked that kind of man. However, the girl protested and said that she would rather die than ever be with this man. However, her aunt has a rejuvenation ruby, though it must be confiscated. The man immediately realized where she was going with this and said it was a pretty interesting situation. Louise also added that in order to use his power, horrifying conditions must be met, and she assumes that her aunt and the Viscount have teamed up to do something terrible. So the girl said emphatically that she would not tolerate such a relic being in the hands of such vile and low people. The man, after listening to her to the end, asked if he understood correctly that, in other words, she wanted to agree to marry him in order to solve their crime and take the ruby as a result. Louise replied that that was all perfectly true. That was her plan. Hinnel asked if she would marry him after that, and if that was what she meant at all. The girl thought that he was quick to grasp things, and that played to her advantage, so she said that was exactly what she planned to do. He sighed, said he understood, and replied that she didn't need any help right now to get the ruby back. He asked if she was going to be all right, and if she was confident in her abilities. Louise, smiling, replied that of course she could handle it all, so he needn't worry. Of course she could expedite their engagement with the Duke and borrow his power, but she also wanted to settle this terrible matter with the Viscount on her own. Her aunt, of course, is just a disgusting person, but still remains her relative, so she wouldn't want to rely on the Duke in this matter. So she thought that she could settle the matter with her relatives on her own. For a while, they just looked at each other in silence. The man pondered the proposal and said that in that case he would like her to bring the ruby with her next time. Smiling, he explained that he would prepare a wedding outfit that would match this magic stone. Louise immediately smiled, for she had been lucky and the meeting with him had gone smoothly. So she replied that they had an agreement, and she was glad that things were working out this way. Immediately afterwards, she and her assistant went outside, and Hinnel watched them leave from the window. Immediately afterward, the butler came into his room and, wiping away his tears, told the young gentleman not to be upset by this refusal. The guy gave him a surprised look and said that the wedding had just been postponed, so he didn't think there was anything to be upset about. The butler laughed and said that was exactly what one would expect from Miss Charty. There was no end of marriage proposals from other young ladies, even an offer to be the groom of a princess from another kingdom. Even though the wedding had been postponed, it was still going to happen, so the butler was content to hear it. Hinnel walked over to a chair and sat down there, sighing heavily. He said that many girls wanted to be his bride, but the most valuable thing in this proposal was, of course, the magical tools. The butler asked if he was not worried that something might go wrong, for it seemed to him that the gentleman was just as nervous. He also said that the Viscount is not ceremonious with girls for a long time, and if this continues, she will become his fifth wife. There are even rumors that he treated his ex-wives rather badly. Soon the guy couldn't stand it all, and asked that the butler stop saying all this because he thinks the girl has some kind of plan, so they better not interfere. Louise at this point began to head back to the city. She told her assistant that at this point they needed to have as much information as possible. Romany suggested that they hurry out of the place, for he didn't like that pig who walked farther away. He also said that they did not have much time left before they met the Viscount. The girl agreed with him and said that they really needed to hurry. In fact, after her aunt had left, she remembered a rather strange occurrence, namely that many girls had disappeared from the city in different places, and they were all young. Even those who lived poorly and without any relatives or ambition were missing. When Romany was still staying with her, he told her about the news and suggested that perhaps this incident had something to do with them. Good Louise, after listening to him, said that she had also heard it rumored that they had gathered to work for a noble family and then disappeared without a trace. Since then, absolutely no one knows what happened to them. The man, adjusting his glasses, said it was just disgusting and horrible. And he also added that it reminded him of the conditions for activating the power of Ruby. Louise said she had a feeling that her aunt and the Viscount were involved in the incident, so she wondered if the aide could find out more about the rumors. Romany said that of course she could rely on him, for as a former from the lower class, he would easily be able to find the information she wanted. And so, when Louise explained the whole situation to the man in the present tense, she said he was talking about the herb seller going missing the other day. Guy replied that this was perfectly true. Some had even seen her getting into a magnificent carriage. When the girl heard that, she thought about it and said that it seemed that girl had agreed to it herself. Louise had no time to finish the sentence, for the aide took her by the arm and, apologizing, said they had better hide. He took her around the corner and stood there so that he could cover her with his body in case of trouble. Louise was tense and wondered what was going on. However, Romany asked that she keep her voice down, for it might be too dangerous, as he noticed that someone was following them. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised, but she already suspected that someone was really following them, but she couldn't figure out who it could be. Soon some little boy appeared in a small street. He looked around and asked where they had gone. This boy already wanted to go somewhere forward. However, Romany didn't have time to jump out and grabbed him by his shirt, saying he caught him. The boy immediately started twisting and turning and screaming in fear. He asked the boy to let him go. Then Louise came out after him. When she saw the boy, she said he was just a little child. He wondered if they were also because of that estate, and also asked that they return his dear little sister to him. Louise, thinking about it, asked what his sister looked like, and also asked if she happened to sell herbs. Tears began to well up in the boy's eyes, and he said that it was quite true, she was a saleswoman. He also said that if he could have stopped her, he would have been fine. The day before, he had asked that she not go to work on that estate, thinking it suspicious that she had been called alone.